After somehow a long break, I'm back on track to create more and more SharePoint related videos. And in this series, I've started a tutorial for client-side object model, or CSOM for short. I call it CSOM 101, and I'm starting from very beginnings of CSOM, and we are moving forward to the most complex topics in client-side object model. I'm not sure how far I'm going, but I am considering something probably around 15 to 20 videos coming in this series to cover the basics of CSOM to somehow like an intermediate level. And after that, we go topic by topic. Okay, in this video, we want to see what is SharePoint client-side object model and what it can be used for, understanding the client-side object model code elements. Then we make a connection to a remote SharePoint server. And finally, we want to read and update SharePoint site properties using the client-side object model. Let's start with understanding what client-side object model is. Traditionally, when we use SharePoint, SharePoint is running on a server, and we use our computer using our browser to get the content from SharePoint and interact with SharePoint. When we use client-side object model, we extend the functionality of SharePoint to our Windows applications, for example, or ASP.NET application, or we extend it to mobile apps or even different platforms. To interact with SharePoint, Microsoft provides a set of APIs over different protocols. But generally speaking, in this series, we are using either Microsoft.NET or JavaScript. Mainly, I will have the focus on Microsoft.NET or managed code to interact with SharePoint remotely. And there are some intermediary APIs that will help us make these calls easier. So in simple words, you can use SharePoint client-side object model to retrieve, update, and manage data in SharePoint 2013 or 2016. SharePoint makes the CSOM available in several forms. There is one very important point to understand. When we are using CSOM, SharePoint server is running on a different computer. So we do not contact SharePoint server on every line of code. Instead, we package all our requests and submit it to SharePoint in one shot. So 4, 5, 10, 20 lines of code packaged together in one context, and that context is sent to SharePoint server. SharePoint executes all of them and sends the results back to us. Failing to follow this basic principle makes your application perform very slow. And I will emphasize on this point again and again, because lots of developers, I noticed that they complain about the performance when it goes to the client-side object model, while if the code is well organized and well packaged, it performs as fast as your server-side code, at least. In this video, our focus will be on managed code, basically C#, and the projects that I will use in this series, at least in the 101 series, I'll be using either ASP.NET or Windows Forms applications. Doesn't matter, they both work the same way. Before we start, we need to add references to the client-side object model or CSOM library. For the managed code, these libraries are Microsoft.SharePoint.client.dll and Microsoft.SharePoint.client.runtime.dll, that we add both of them to the client application, whether it's Windows applications or ASP.NET. And right after that, we need to add the right namespace. We can say using Microsoft.SharePoint.client, I always alias it because I don't want the forms object in Windows is mixed up with the form object in the SharePoint library. There's a simple example of the code. So I specified the site URL, and here is our key object. It's called client context. Client context basically is like an envelope. You package your code inside it, close it, and then send it to the SharePoint server by running the function called execute query. So between this client context, whatever the code that we put together, it doesn't go to SharePoint until we call this execute query. Now that's exactly the same code. To make it a little bit more stylish, I create a client context in the using syntax. So right after this bracket, garbage collector will take care of it. Inside the code, when I want to call the load function, instead of loading the entire web object, I'm using the link queries to specifically load the properties that I need, which are title and description in this example. Now we want to make a connection to the remote SharePoint server, and reading and updating the SharePoint site properties using CSOM. Let's go to Visual Studio and see how it is done. I'm back to Visual Studio. I create a new project. The project is going to be Windows Forms application, and I call it CSOM 101 Web Properties. As I mentioned before, we start by adding the references. So we add the Microsoft.SharePoint.client.dll and Microsoft.SharePoint.runtime.dll. They're all in the 16 Hive folder under ISAPI. So program files, common files, Microsoft shared, web server extensions, 16, and ISAPI. So you'll find this one and this one. Once they are added to my project, I can start my coding. So the first piece that I want to do, I want to add a button to this form, and I want to call it Read Web Title. And this is the website that I have. The title is CSOM 101. And in my Windows application, I want to make a remote connection from this application to the website that I have and read the title of that website and display it in a message box. So I double click on the button, I go to the top of the page, and I add the using Microsoft.SharePoint.client. And as you can see, the moment that I add this, it gives me some conflict for the form object in Windows Form, and that's the reason I would like to alias it, and I call it SP client or whatever else that you want to call it. So this SP client is going to be the prefix for all my SharePoint related objects. I start by creating SP client.client context. I call it CTX equals new, and SP client.client context, and as a parameter I need to add the URL to that website, which is here. Right after that, I can get the reference to the web object. So SP client.web, I call it my web equals ctx.web. Now that I have the reference to the web object, reading the properties of the web is very easy, but I need to load it because this object, remember, it's on the remote machine. So I would say ctx.load my web, which actually loads the entire web object. And right after that, I want to execute this code and get the properties. So I would say ctx.execute query. Remember that envelope. After this is done, I have all the properties of my web, and I can display it in a message box. So message box.show my web.title. Let me run this code, and if I click on it, it's going to show me CSOM 101. Or if I want to make it a better quality code, I can say w.title. So this link query only selects the title of this web object for the load function, so it doesn't read all the properties. So basically it's going to be a lighter code. So if I run it, I can click on read, and it performs exactly the same action. Now in the next step, I would like to add another button to this code, and I would say update title. So I double click on this code, and because I'm almost running the same code, I can copy and paste this code here. The only thing is that now I don't want to load anything. So I just have the web object. I would say my web.title, and I can say CSOM 101 update updated. And I would say myweb.update. This is very important. Even the update line doesn't do anything until I run the execute query, and after that the update happens. And I don't want to display it here. I just run this code, click on the update title, and I go back to my page, and if I click on refresh, it's going to say CSOM 101 updated. If you find this video useful, please like and share. Thank you for watching.